their birth, not in this era, but instead in the 14th and 15th century of Europe. You know, the age of discovery. I have to put discovery in quotation marks because, after all, what did those Europeans discover in the 14th and 15th century? Africa, Asia, later North and South America. Newsflash. There were people living there. They weren't lost. They didn't need to be discovered. And so, in the same spirit of truth-telling and honesty, let's just acknowledge that the 14th and 15th century of Europe was actually the age of rape and pillage and plunder and murder. There's one word for me that sums that up. That's the age of empire. That's what imperialism means. It means beating people down. It means killing them. It means stealing their resources. There's nothing pretty about it. There's no way to sugarcoat that. Imperialism is vicious. And get this, the modern transnational corporation didn't just sort of accidentally get created during this time period. The modern transnational corporation was intentionally and deliberately created as an instrument of empire, and those instruments, upon initial creation, were called joint stock companies. For example, one of the most famous of those early joint stock companies was known as the East India Company. Perhaps you've heard of it. Literally, initially chartered and designed in order to facilitate the military conquest of the entire subcontinent of India. And not only that, to systematically oppress the people who lived there, to force them to help to steal the resources from their own land and send them back as profits to the shareholders of the joint stock company. Another of the early corporations or joint stock companies was the Africa Trading Company. Would anybody like to guess what the Africa Trading Company traded? You know, I'm going to use myself as an example because I think it's important for white people to have honest conversations about race. And I will tell you, using myself as an example, that if I'm not really clear, if I'm not really being sharp in my thinking, if I was just asked what did the Africa Trading Company trade, the word that would pop into my head, unbidden to me, slaves. I mean, after all, we were taught as children about the Africa slave trade. We were even taught about the Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth as champion runaway slaves who helped to free other runaway slaves, right? That language was how I was taught to think about it. But now that I've made such a big deal about that particular word, let me do a follow-up question and ask. In the 14th and 15th century, when the Africa Trading Company was operating, was Africa populated by slaves? No, Africa was populated by people. Human beings. Africa was populated by people. People who were basically just like me. Now, I say that with some trepidation, but conviction. Trepidation because I know what skin color I have. I'm not stupid. I know I'm a white person. But I say it with conviction because if you ask any scientist, if you ask any biologist, she or he will tell you race does not exist. Sure, skin color exists, pigment exists, but so does eye color and hair color and other kinds of trivial distinctions. No scientist would elevate pigment to a classification or a taxonomy. So race does not exist, but check this out. Racism damn sure does. How can that possibly be? Oh yes, if enough people think that something is true, if enough people act like it's true, race is a construct just as surely as the corporation is a construct. And in order to illustrate that, tell me your first name again? John. We use John as an example. And let's say that John and David live in different tribes. And there's a river that separates my tribe from John's tribe. And my tribe goes to war against John's tribe. And my tribe wins this war. And by the way, why do y'all think my tribe might win this war? What are some reasons why one tribe wins a war against another tribe? More people, more resources and better weapons. Those are the two that come up to almost everybody. But I haven't given you all enough background or enough facts to really know for certain why my tribe wins the war against John's tribe. But should I tell you why my tribe wins the war against John's tribe? Louder.
Because you're telling the story.
Because I'm still telling the story. Stories matter. George Lakoff was very smart. Unfortunately for you, John, I am telling this story. So my tribe wins the war against John's tribe, so I pull out my sword, I put my sword to John's throat, and I say, John, you're now my slave. Folks, in this scenario, what is the intellectual or philosophical justification for David to enslave John? There isn't one. It's the sword. It's power. Nothing more. The point I'm asking us to recognize is this. That the construct of race got created during this time period in order to try to justify intellectually the repugnant, the ridiculous, the stupid, the depraved idea that one can justify enslavement on the basis of pigment. It's crazy. Another way to say that, my friends, the reason I'm going down this track in this particular presentation is to force us to confront the reality that corporatism, imperialism, and racism are inextricably linked concepts. And what links them? Oppression and exploitation. And my friends, I am not the first American to say that, because the most famous American orator of all time said basically the same thing in what I believe is his best political speech. It's not this fellow's most famous speech, because his most famous speech is, I have a dream. Who am I talking about? Martin Luther King, of course. And Martin Luther King Jr., that I have a dream speech is a beautiful speech. It's a powerful speech, but it's not his best political speech. For my money, King's best political speech was not delivered in Washington, D.C. King's best political speech was delivered in New York City, specifically in Harlem, the Riverside Church. I see several of you know this speech. It's known as Beyond War or Beyond Vietnam. And in that speech, King said, the United States of America is suffering from a spiritual and moral decay. King was a man of faith. This is strong language. He said we are suffering from a spiritual and moral decay because of the triple evils. I mean, a strong language. Evils of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism, or just greed. And King said the United States can't become the country that we want it to be. King said we can't become the country that we deserve it to be. King said we can't become the country that God intends us to be unless and until we deal with those oppressive and exploitive points within our society. And you know what? King was right. He was right then, and he's right now. We are right on the verge of being able to completely recreate our entire social, political, economic, and cultural reality if only we would address the underlying roots of exploitation and oppression. And if we deal with that, I promise you, that world unfolds. That world becomes ours right here, right now. And since I've finally gotten around to America in my story, remember I'm telling a story, here's a question. How many colonies in the founding of the United States of America? 13. Come on, y'all, we're in Virginia. Y'all know this, right? How many colonies?
13.
13. So here's the real question. Of those 13 colonies, how many of them were corporations? Nicely done. It was a trick question, but the way I'm asking it, all of them. Because remember that the word corporation means to have or create body. I'm here to tell you that it took the king to create each one of those colonies. The king created Virginia. The king created Massachusetts. Now some of you might be saying, Virginia was already here. That's why it's a trick question. The land was here. The mountains and the rivers and the forests and the people. You know, physical reality was here. But it took the king to create it as Virginia. And now we're going to do another little exercise to explain just exactly how that works. Because the king created Virginia and Massachusetts and all the other colonies by the use of a particular legal instrument. Anybody know what that instrument is called? Charter. Nicely done. It's a charter. To illustrate how this works, we'll do another little exercise. In this exercise, I'll be the king. Why am I the king? Don't tell me the story. And now, John, it'll be good to sit where you sit. I'm going to make you a governor. Watch this. And I'm going to use Massachusetts as the example. Not because I think Massachusetts is more important, but because I actually know the language of the original charter that created Massachusetts. So, watch this. I, the king, using nothing but a writing instrument and a piece of paper in my political power, will now bring into existence Massachusetts. But of course, I'm not going to bother myself with the day-to-day affairs of governing Massachusetts. After all, I've got other people to rape and pillage and plunder and murder. Apparently, these are kingly duties at that time. But so now, in this charter, I will assign a royal governor. and assigned that royal governor the task and responsibility under law to plant, and this is a direct quote from the actual charter, to plant, to rule, and to govern this new area on my behalf, on the behalf of the king, to benefit me, the king, and to benefit the other shareholders of the joint stock company known as the Massachusetts Bay Trading Company. Massachusetts began as a for-profit corporation, just exactly like the East India Company. In fact, Virginia didn't begin as the state of Virginia, did it? No. What did it begin as?
Virginia Company.
The Virginia Company. Literally, that was the charter, the Virginia Company. It was also a for-profit corporation. Georgia was a penal corporation. Quick question, anybody know what skin color or pigment the original slaves that worked Georgia had? White. The first ones were white. I'm telling you folks, as white people, we would really benefit a lot from learning more about the creation of race, and specifically the creation of whiteness. Because my way of thinking it, my way of understanding it, as a working class person and as somebody who grew up in poverty, it went something like this. Even though the boss man has his boot on white people's necks, just as sure as anybody else, working class white guy can say, hey, but at least I'm white. I really think that we would really, it would help us if we actually understood that race and whiteness got created to bamboozle us. To think that we're actually separate and apart or somehow better than other human beings, so we would not actually see. Actually, what's going on is a small 1% up there who happen to have the same pigment as us, but are crapping on us as well as everybody else. I'm telling you, this idea of race matters. But the point is, folks, in this little story, John, we would not in contemporary times think of him or call him a royal governor. What word would we use to describe John today? Say it again. CEO, a chief executive officer. The point I'm making is the American revolutionaries were not calling for a more socially responsible king. They were not calling for more socially responsible CEOs. So perhaps today in our movement we can do the same. Maybe we could raise our aspirations a little higher than to constantly be begging and pleading these CEOs to please cause less harm, or please don't be quite so abusive, or please don't kill quite so many coal miners, or please don't destroy the entire freaking Gulf of Mexico. Maybe we can raise our aspirations a little higher. That's our historic legacy. Another way to think about it, folks, is that those patriots at the Boston Tea Party, that phenomenon was actually, properly understood, an act of nonviolent civil disobedience targeting a specific corporation. Do you think that the Boston Patriots threw all the tea in the harbor that night? They targeted one corporation. Do you know what it was? The East India Company, and that's the only tea that went in the harbor that night. It was an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. Sometimes I wish the Tea Party Patriots would do a little more research. It might be helpful. Now, I said that the American revolutionaries weren't calling for a more socially responsible king, but actually about 10 years before the revolution erupted, those same people who would become revolutionaries were writing letters to the king that went like this: "Oh, Father King, we, your humble children here in the colonies, come before you on bended knee to beg that you intervene on our behalf, because your royal governor is administering unfair laws, mostly laws written by the English Parliament, that are benefiting the East India Company monopoly, and it's unfair." Quick pop quiz. Anybody know what percentage of the English Parliament who were writing those laws owned shares in the East India Company at this time?
100%.
100%. Alan, I wonder if that's related. "Oh, Father King, we come before you on bended knee to ask that you intervene on our behalf as good, loyal English subjects and servants to you, O mighty one." It was the most sniveling, groveling language that you can imagine. I'm not joking. That's the actual letter those people were writing to the king at that time. And I don't know about you, but I am keenly interested in trying to understand what sort of stories did they start to tell each other that convinced them to stop the groveling, to stop the boot kissing, to stop crawling on their bellies to the king and begging, and instead to get up off their knees and to stand up straight. To stand up proud and look directly at the king, you know, the king who claimed cultural authority from God, and to see behind the king the most powerful military the world had ever assembled and said, "You're done, get out, we're going to do it different." Because let me tell you something, folks, that process is magic. And I want to be clear, magic doesn't just happen, it has to be invoked, right? It has to be created. And may I say that if one person stands up against oppression and injustice against all odds, that is a courageous act that deserves our gratitude, our appreciation, our honor, but that act alone is not magic. Because you see, the magic can only be invoked when one person stands up against injustice and oppression against all odds, and somebody to her left stands up, and somebody to her right stands up, and you have this collective standing up together. That's what a social movement is like. And at this point, may I just say, may the goddess bless the Occupy movement.
Yes.
Because for whatever faults and whatever deficiencies and whatever we might say about the Occupy, let's just acknowledge that something magical is happening there. Because it's not just that they're inviting us to occupy public space. Deeper still, the Occupy movement invites us. The Occupy movement challenges us. The Occupy movement dares us to occupy imagination space. To imagine what it would be like if we actually went about the world of recreating our society. To imagine that we had the capacity and the ability to do it. And you know why they're challenging and daring us to consider that? Because we do. If we would just start to act and think differently. And so, to finish up my little story, I was talking about the American Revolution, and for those of you who are waiting with bated breath to know, I'll just go ahead and cut to the chase and tell you, the American colonists won. So the king gets thrown out, right? And so a new charter gets created. That new charter is used to describe the supreme law of the land and how our system of government is supposed to operate. What is that charter called? The Constitution. Folks, how many here have read the U.S. Constitution? Be honest. Oh, good. Almost every hand goes up. So y'all read my papers. See if I get this more or less right. Because I will tell you, when you read the Constitution in its entirety, and not just individual words, but read and understand the pattern. As my mama would say, son, step back. See how the whole thing operates. That's where reality is, when you can see systems. So when we read the Constitution that way, I'll tell you, I believe you'll see two principal actors in place. The first actor is the most important actor. In fact, it's so important it's the first three words. We. All I have to do is put my hand to my ear and people say it in unison. We the people. That's because these are hallowed words in this country, and they should be. See, we the people come together to create the second actor, which is government itself. Just take a moment to acknowledge, in this scenario, we the people create government. Government is a construct that we construct collectively. It is ours, it is us. That's a very powerful idea in this framework. We the people create government, and we the people in this framework are understood and described as being free and sovereign as a people. And what does the word sovereign mean again? The authority to rule. The king is not sovereign. We kicked his butt out. The king doesn't have authority to rule here anymore, but get this. Government isn't sovereign either. The government doesn't have the authority to rule over us. In fact, in this framework, government is subordinate and accountable. Government is subordinate to whom?
People.
The people. Government is accountable to whom? The people. That's got a ring to it, doesn't it? I like how this is going. Let's continue. We the people are free and sovereign because we the people have rights. Government does not have rights. Government only has duties. And as a lawyer, let me just stop for a moment and say, there is a big difference between rights and duties. If I've got the right to do something, it means I can do it. And I don't need anybody's permission. I don't need the City Council of Richmond to give me permission. I don't need the Virginia State Legislature to give me permission. Thank goodness, actually, given. I don't need the United States Congress to give me permission. Y'all, I'm from Texas. I don't need my mama's permission. Well, not legally. I mean, if any of you know Texas culture and my own mama, don't tell her I said that. But I will say I don't legally need her permission. How about that? Point is, folks, if you've got the right to do something, you can just damn well do it. And if government tries to infringe upon you exercising any of your core constitutional rights, government is wrong, not you, and you should be able to go into court and have that law overturned. This idea is powerful. Government does not have rights against and over the people, ever. Government, in fact, only has duties to the people. And where do governmental duties come from? Well, remember, all power resides with the people. This is another of those magical ideas, and it's an important one. The people have all the power. Quick pop quiz. What is the population, more or less, of Richmond, Virginia? 200,000, more or less? So let's just celebrate the fact that 200,000 people in Richmond have all the political power, right? But I'll tell you this, I don't want to go to a meeting of 200,000 people where we decide, where should we put stop signs? And I like political meetings. I'm not going to that one. Anybody here imagine facilitating a meeting of 200,000 people where we make and implement a decision? Right? Here's the thing, y'all. Under our framework, yes, the people in any jurisdiction, local, state, or federal, however you define it, hold the political power, but we delegate a certain amount of our power to government. How much power do we delegate to government? All of it? Heck no! Only enough to perform the duties that we have said. This, my friends, is what limited government means. Government is limited to the power that it takes to perform the duties that we want them to do. And how does government perform those duties? By writing laws that are in the public interest. Let me just acknowledge that there is going to be a huge debate on what a law should be, and that's fine. In fact, if we had a functioning democratic republic, we would create mechanisms where there was civil discourse and debate about what laws we should have and not, right? And I can imagine actually creating a space where there was actual, honest disagreement, and we worked out those disagreements through public processes in order to come up with public laws. But even if we had a beautiful, functioning democratic republic, I want to be clear about something. Even if the majority of everybody decided on a public law through an accountable process, if any law actually violates the private rights of any of the citizens, then that private citizen could go into court and overturn that law. See how this works? Hold on, y'all. Mrs. Armstrong was right after all. Look at this. In the constitutional framework, we the people are free and sovereign. We hold all the political power in this country. We delegate a certain amount of our power to government. Government which we will hold subordinate and accountable to we the people. Government will be tasked with certain duties that they will then discharge their duties by writing laws in the public interest. But no law can ever actually violate the private rights of any of the sovereign citizens who live here. I mean, our civil liberties are supposed to be protected, and yet we have public processes by which we make and implement decisions. The balance is beautiful. It's genius. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that wonderful? We should try that in this country. This would work. And I'm not even joking. This is beautiful. And I'm not joking. It would work. And I'm not joking that we've never tried it. Because before I go 1 second further waxing poetic about how beautiful and brilliant the U.S. Constitution is, a quick time out, my friends, so that I can ask, in what year does the U.S. Constitution get either drafted in secret convention or ratified? 1789. Nicely done. 1789 is the date I'm looking for, because that's the ratification date. 1787 is the Constitutional Convention, but the important date for my money as a lawyer, that ratification date, because that's the date that we know this becomes the supreme law of the land. The reason I want that date certain is so that now that we understand what legal personhood means, who is a person under law in the U.S. Constitution in 1789?
White men.
White men. Is it all the white men?
Landowners.
Only the wealthy landowning white men. Saying it another way, for all this beautiful framework, and it is a beautiful framework, the problem is not in the framework. The problem is in its implementation. Because in its implementation, this is a founding violence against the indigenous people who were already here and were subject to intentional, deliberate genocide. It's an intentional violence against the Africans who were brought the barrel of a gun and forced to build this country with slave labor. It's a founding violence against the women who were subjected to oppressive laws. Women couldn't even enter into contracts. You know why? Because they didn't have capacity. Women were like children, and they could not legally bind themselves. Women couldn't even own property. Women were property by any reasonable understanding of that word. And, my friends, it's also a founding violence against most of the white men who lived here. Because most of the white men were either indentured servants or, at best, second-class citizens. In fact, anybody know what percentage of the actual adults living in the new United States of America in 1789 were legally persons? What percentage do you think that would be? 1%. That's great. Right? The 1% meme is a beautiful meme. But don't be so cynical. What percentage do you think honestly were legally persons?
12.
A third?
5.
Nicely done. You were the first person who was sufficiently cynical. Almost nobody suspects it's that low, but the answer is about 5% of the actual human beings literally were legal persons. Another way to say this, folks, is how Howard Zinn said it. And that is, and may the goddess rest his soul. Howard Zinn said, to understand U.S. history, perhaps the most important way is to understand it as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be defined as persons with rights under our Constitution. That's so important, I'm going to say it again quickly. Probably the most important way to understand the story of the United States is as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be defined as legal persons who have rights that will be acknowledged and respected under our Constitution. Now, some people might say, in fact, I have been told this, look, Cobb, you got a scathing indictment about imperialism of 500 years ago, but today, man, we got rid of slavery in this country. Women can vote. It's all good now, bro. To that person I said, au contraire, mon frere. It ain't all good now, bro. It ain't all good at all. And I think a big part of the reason it ain't all good now is the operation of the most dominant institution on planet Earth today. And that institution is the transnational corporation. And since we've just explained how our politics and our legal system is supposed to operate, it might behoove us to ask where should a corporation go here? And in order to do that, I'll ask this quick question. What does it take to form a corporation in Virginia today?
Money.
How much money? Anybody know?
Not a lot. No.
500. It's 500.
It's about, I think it's about 100. That's if you get a lawyer involved. But if you get the filing fee, it's about $100, right?
Wow, that's filing fee.
Yeah, filing fee. I mean, look. So the thing is, if you know how to fill out the paperwork and you do it correctly, and your check clears, do you know what the Secretary of State will do with that piece of paper? An application? They'll stamp it and issue you a charter. Do you know how long your charter can last in Virginia today? Forever. It can outlive you, outlive any of us in this room. Do you know what you can do with the corporate charter in Virginia according to the Virginia Corporation Code? All lawful activities, any legal thing. Now, apparently, if you have enough money, you can do a lot of illegal things and get away with your corporate charter. But the point I'm making is we don't even today, most of us don't really think about the corporation as an institution and what this most ubiquitous, most pervasive institution is all about. Now I'm going to take you back to 1789 and just share with you very quickly in 1789 what it took to form a corporation. And this, by the way, was true for the next 75 to 100 years in this country. First, you had to get a bill introduced in the lower house of your state government, or the state house of representatives, or the state assembly. And that paperwork had to be approved by a majority vote. But you're not finished because now your paperwork goes to the state senate. And it has to pass by a majority vote. And you're still not through because now your paperwork goes to the governor who has to be willing to sign it. My friends, have I described the creation of a corporation today? No. Of course not. What have I just described today? A law. How a bill becomes a law. Anybody besides me worked on trying to get lobbying and legislating? Am I the only one? Lots of hands go up. So how easy was that? Right? It's crazy hard. The point I'm making is the act of legislation is a high political burden. And the point I'm making, there was a time in this country where just getting the privilege of limited liability was considered that same phenomenon. And by the way, that's just the mechanics. Now let me tell you the substance of your application. You had to identify a public need that was not being met by businesses that did not have the privilege of limited liability. And if you were granted that privilege, not the right, but the privilege of limited liability, all you could ever do was that specific thing that you had identified. And if you did any other kind of business other than that specific business, you know what could happen to your corporate charter? Revoked. Corporate charters were once routinely revoked merely for going ultra vires, or in Latin, beyond the authority of the initial charter. By the way, do you know how long that corporate charter would typically last? 5, 10 years, 20 years at the most. Every corporate charter written into it had a specific expiration date. And at the end of that time period, the limited liability evaporated. The business could continue, but the privilege of limited liability ended. And if you wanted to continue limited liability, you had to go through the process all over again. Oh, and by the way, even if you were doing the specific thing that you said you would do, even if you were in that narrow window of time for which your corporate charter was enacted, if you ever did anything that violated the public trust, do you know what happened to your corporate charter? Revoked. Corporate charters were routinely revoked merely for acting outside the public interest. Let me ask you folks, can we imagine a single one of the Fortune 500s that could even exist today? This is not, look folks, this is not my wishful thinking. This is our history. Our history, we once properly controlled the institution known as the corporation under the political system. Now, I'm not saying this was the land of milk and honey in 1789. Remember slavery? Remember the oppression of women and patriarchy? Remember how working class white people were oppressed? But what I'm making is not that this was the land of milk and honey. What I'm saying is the instrument known as a corporation was under proper political control. And so, my friends, now that we understand that it takes an action of state government to issue a corporate charter, we understand that the charter can be used to hold the corporation subordinate and accountable. We understand that the corporate charter describes the duties of what a corporation can do. We understand that a corporation should only operate if it's operating in the public trust. Isn't it just obvious that a corporation goes here so that it can be under the political control of we the people and our elected representatives acting on our behalf? Isn't that just obvious? And so thank you for your patience, because here comes the punchline. When the United States Supreme Court, in an act of supreme judicial activism, by the way, says, even though the word corporation is never mentioned in our Constitution, we are going to assert, 9 of us, hell, 5 of us, are going to tell 300 million of you, sovereign citizens of the United States, we require you now to treat a corporation as if it's a person with rights. It perverts this whole framework. See, corporate personhood is not just a legal technicality. Corporate personhood is not just a stupid idea, which it is. Corporate personhood is the linchpin for how the ruling elite have stolen our country from us. They have literally hijacked our ability to govern ourselves. And as a lawyer, what really pisses me off is that they use our legal system to legitimize the theft. They tell us that we can't actually pass laws to control these corporations because it somehow violates corporations' constitutional rights. Well, I say ya basta. Enough already. It's time for us to do what other movements have done, and that's to band together, to educate, to agitate, and to organize, and to make demands clearly and unambiguously about the systemic change we need. And we at Move to Amend are clear. Our demands are 2 of the constitutional amendment. 1, abolish all corporate constitutional rights.
Yes.
Corporations are not people. They do not have constitutional rights. And my friends, that includes both for-profit and non-profit corporations. Corporations are artificial entities. They do not have constitutional rights. They have legal privileges that are subject to the political process. Only human beings have constitutional rights. This demand is also known as the well duh demand. The other demand is to abolish the equally odious, also court-created idea that money equals speech. This doctrine has been used to allow wealthy individuals to spend unlimited amounts of money. In fact, 200 people have spent over 80% of all the money that has come flooding into the political process in this election year. 200 people, 80% of all of the money comes from just 200 people. This is outrageous. And I want to be clear, this is going to take a constitutional amendment because the court created these doctrines by which they are overturning democratically enacted laws. And I also want to say this. I don't want like, it's got to be both. Because I don't want to do all the money, all the work to get money out of elections, only to be told, oh, but corporate lawyers can still use constitutional rights to overturn environmental protection laws, worker safety laws, public health laws, and other laws. Also, I don't want to do all the work of overturning corporate personhood, only to be told, oh, but the rich can spend unlimited amounts of their own personal money as a constitutional right. We've got to do both of these. Does that make sense to y'all?
Yes.
Is that right? Yes. So here's the thing, folks. If you want to join this movement, I am now going to pass around a clipboard. And I've got 3 of them. And I want to be clear, as these come around, my friend, this is not a petition that we are going to submit on bended knee to any elected official. This is an organizing petition. And if you're willing to sign up and join, know that we're going to be in touch with you. Because, and by the way, as this comes around, because we're going to be in touch with you, I have one real request. Like, if you want to join this movement, you know, and I hope you do, please do sign up. I mean, if you don't want to join the movement, just pass it. I mean, I won't be offended, personally. I mean, I'll be surprised. But if you don't want to join, you don't have to. But if you're going to join, and I hope you will, print legibly. Man, as an organizer, there is nothing more frustrating than not being able to get in touch with somebody. So as that comes around, if you want to join, stop, take your time, and if you have bad handwriting like me, slow down. We'll wait. I won't leave before everybody gets a chance to join. So as that goes around, do that. And now, what I'd like to ask, if anybody wants to make a comment, ask a question, or just get involved in discussion, raise your hand. So what we're going to do is say number 1.